Excellent, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about dogs on beaches and the challenges for managing shorebirds, and I'll be presenting some of the research I've done at BirdLife Australia in collaboration with Mike Weston from Deakin University, plus a number of other researchers. So most of the Australian population lives within 85 kilometres of the 85% of the Australian population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast. And you can see that it's most densely populated on the eastern and the southern states. And we happen to have the highest pet ownership in the world. So there are 4.2 million pet dogs in Australia, 39% of households own a dog, and this is highest in Victoria and New South Wales, which happen to be the most populated of our states, where the density of living is quite close and space is very limited. So beaches are seen as these public open spaces that are available and safe for dog walking, and they're very popular for dog walkers to go to. And Australia's beaches happen to also be really critical habitat for shorebirds. So they're providing that habitat for migratory shorebirds for roosting and foraging, but also for our resident shorebirds for breeding and for their survival. Dogs are known to have demonstrated negative as well as lethal impacts on shorebirds. So the disturbance they can cause to roosting and foraging migratory shorebirds can really upset their energetic balances and be costly for their migratory journey. But also for resident shorebirds that are breeding on beaches, dogs can cause lethal disturbance to incubating birds, exposing those eggs to harsh temperatures or to predators, but they can also predate the flightless chicks and also crush the eggs. And so there's real competition for beaches and public open spaces between people and dogs who really want to use those spaces and the shorebirds who need those beaches for their survival. So how do we successfully manage this threat? If we take that approach of straight away approaching it as let's remove dogs from any of our shorebird habitats, we run the risk of making a lot of dog owners angry and polarising communities. And this can scare decision makers, and it can often mean that the shorebirds lose, in that decision makers are too scared to set aside these habitats for the birds, and instead they keep them open for dog access. So in a way, we really need to find that balance between, striking that balance between dog access as well as the shorebirds' needs. And so we need to explore, is this really a feasible option? Will this work successfully? Can we achieve coexistence? So how are dogs currently managed on beaches in Australia? This map here that's colour-coded shows that you can have a whole range of different dog regulations for accessing the coast, and these can vary along that coastline. You can have off-leash dog areas where dogs are allowed to access the beach and run around off the lead. You can have beaches that are only where dogs must be on a lead and accompanied by their owner for a walk. And then you can have stretches of coast that are no dogs accessible. So do these management zones actually work? Are these dog zones effectively constraining dog space use on beaches and allowing the birds to have the space they need to breed? Are dog walkers complying with the regulations? And if not, what are those barriers to compliance with regulations on beaches? So the first study I'm going to present is looking at space use of dogs on beaches. So we wanted to learn on those on-leash beaches, is that effectively constraining the space use by dogs on the beach? And so we compared 8 beaches, 4 of those were on-leash and 4 of them were off-leash zones. And we fitted 161 dogs with I Got You loggers, so we could track their movements as they moved along the beach. And so this was typical of a trace of a dog walking on the beach, on the leash along the beach. And you can see it's a very linear movement, very constrained. This is typical of an off-leash dog walk. So you can see there's a high density of activity, particularly in the center of that image, where the dog has spent a lot of time running around. And here's another example of an off-leash dog walk where the dog has actually moved 33 kilometres back and forth and around in only a 3-kilometre stretch of beach. So did this space use, when we compared the movement of the dogs using the on-leash zones versus the off-leash zones, did it actually vary? Well, we found no significant differences. So the average speed of the movement of the dogs was similar in the on-leash zones and off-leash zones. The length of beach was similar, approximately 1 kilometre of beach for each dog walk, and the density of activity, so the depth of beach they were using, was also similar. So this seems surprising to us, because if we looked at a known trace of an on-leash dog versus an off-leash dog, they look strikingly different, and you would expect that there would be differences in space use. So part of this study also involved making observations of dog compliance on those beaches. So we observed 555 dogs using those on and off leash zones. 81% of all dogs were off the leash that were observed. 71% of the 199 dogs at the on-leash beaches were actually off the leash. So the reason that we're not getting that significant difference between the on-leash and the off-leash sites is because of the lack of compliance. So in essence, those on-leash regulations aren't working, and they're not constraining space use. So this led to our second study, which was to explore compliance a bit further. That was only at a small section of the coast, and we wanted to see if that was representative across the entire coastline. So our study was carried out along the Victorian coast, which is the state in Australia that's circled in red. And we explored compliance across 6 of the most common regulation types. So that's off-leash access, where dogs can run about; effective control, which is very similar to off-leash, but the dogs need to be close enough to their owner to be responsive to voice control; on-leash access, where they're on the leash; seasonal on-leash, which means at a certain time of year they must be on the leash; time restricted on leash, which is a certain time of day they must be on the leash; and no dog areas. We carried out 3,500 spot checks at 69 ocean beaches. These are actually our hooded plover sites. So this is a highly threatened shorebird in Victoria that we're monitoring and helping conserve. So when people would go to the beach to monitor the birds, they'd also record the threats present. And this included whether dogs were present and whether they were on or off the leash. So in total, 2,698 dogs were sighted on 28% of visits and at 87% of sites. There were 9 sites where dogs were never observed. All of those were no dog areas. But you can see from this graph below, which presents the number of visits made in blue and the number of dogs observed in red, that the occurrence of dogs at the different sites was heavily influenced by the regulations. So you were more likely to get a lot of dogs at those effective control sites that was very popular for dogs to visit those sites, and also lots of dogs at off-leash sites. Whereas the no dog sites, you're getting fewer dogs. Of course, you're not really supposed to be getting any dogs, but that's interesting. So we then go to look at compliance at those sites. We can't really look at compliance at off-leash sites or effective control because they're allowed to do anything they want essentially there. But if we look at the on-leash sites, seasonal on-leash, time-restricted leash, and no dog sites, we can see that 72% of all the dogs observed across those 4 regulation types were off the leash. So that's 72% non-compliance in total. You can see that the percentage of non-compliance did vary quite significantly across the different regulation types, with on-leash sites having the poorest compliance of any, but the no-dog sites having the highest compliance. So overall, it seems that the regulations that are put in place to manage dog impacts have really poor compliance. Very little people do the right thing. However, it does seem to effectively influence this distribution of dogs. So you're getting more dogs visiting those sites that are allowed to be off leash or under effective control. And so that makes us think, are dog owners trying to make the right choices and you know, making that decision to choose to visit those sites, or is it just random that occurred? And we can explore that further. However, it does show that the really poor compliance at the leash only sites really presents a challenge for us in our approach to having a coexistence approach, so sharing the beach with the birds and the dogs, because people just aren't leashing the dogs to minimise those impacts. So that approach isn't really effectively working for us. So we then need to know more about why are people not complying. We need to know more of the social science. So we carried out a study looking into barriers to leashing dogs on beaches and surveyed 385 dog walkers across Victoria. And so 86 of those were interviews carried out on the beach, and another 299 were postal surveys. 33% of dog walkers felt strongly obliged to leash their dog on the beach. 22% only felt weakly obliged, and 45% didn't feel obliged to leash their dog at all when at the beach. And we asked them a lot more questions about, why do you feel unobliged to leash your dog? And we found that the decision to leash dogs on the beach was influenced by the social norms. That is, are other people doing it? If so, then I will do it too. But also, if they believed their own dog might have a negative impact, if they know their dog runs and jumps on people or chases birds or is, will cause a negative impact, they're more likely to have their dog on the lead. There were three main attitudinal factors that acted as barriers to leashing. And they were that people thought, protecting wildlife was a really important cause, but they felt equally that their dog having the right to exercise was also a really important cause. There was a real lack of understanding about how dogs impact birds. Most people had no knowledge of what disturbance was and what just being, in proximity to these birds could be having an impact. And then lastly, there was an overall belief that dogs cause a great threat to birds. However, not their individual dog, not my dog, it's other people's dogs. So with all this in mind and all that we've learned over the three studies, it presents some real challenges for managing dogs on beaches for shorebird protection. There are things that we really need to do to approach this issue better. And that is, we really need to have great maps, great spatial layers of where all our shorebirds' habitats are and what the dog regulations are. Really on some of the things we've learned from our research on managing dogs on beaches to help shorebirds out. So that real need to have great maps and spatial layers of those highest priority shorebird sites, to work with coastal planners to make sure that before we tackle, maybe removing dogs from sites, that we need to make sure there are alternative off-leash areas for people to walk their dogs, so that we can avoid that human-wildlife conflict. It's really important now that we've learned that compliance is highest with the no-dog sites to look at making some of our highest priority shorebird sites as dog prohibited areas. We need to always make sure that we're monitoring the threats alongside monitoring the birds, and that enables us to evaluate whether managements are working. We need to work at educating dog walkers, because it was clear from some of the social research that disturbance is really poorly understood. And I guess, that is a lot harder for the layperson to understand. And we need to work with land managers to carry out compliance patrols so we can start to shift those social norms. So more people see people with their dogs on the lead and start to do the right thing. And then just lastly, we need more of an emotional connection with shorebirds, because it's really strong, that emotional connection with pets and with your own dog, but that's not as strong as for the shorebirds. And so that's why we tend to use a lot of the really cute little flagships, especially pictures of their chicks and how vulnerable they are, to create that emotional connection. And that's all that I had. Cool.